Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's lunchtime webinar. It's 12:30. So as long as you're ready, Neil, I'm going to kick things
Yeah,
off. First of all, by saying a really big hello. I hope everybody is warm and cozy wherever you are, wherever you're joining us from. Certainly pretty frosty and misty down here in Somerset. Today's session, we are joined by experienced ecologist, and botanist with Avellana Ecology, Neill Talbot. And actually, Neil is also quite a long-standing, been quite a few years now, hasn't it, Neil?
yeah,
MPMS volunteer. So thank you so much for all existing MPMS volunteers who are joining us today, but also welcome to anybody who is new to the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. If you are new, do please go and visit our website, mpms.org.uk, after the webinar and find out a little bit more about who we are and what we do. This webinar forms part of our annual training and engagement series, our programme for our volunteers. And today we're going to be talking about, or Neil more specifically, is going to be talking about winter trees, so how we can identify native broadleaves in autumn and winter. I think this is a brilliant topic to be covering today because I actually think it's National Tree Week this week. And
yes,
of
yes,
course,
it is.
yeah, it is. And even though it's winter, of course, we can still get out and we can be taking a look at the trees in our plots, perhaps during our recce's over the winter, before the field season, perhaps just while we're out on a dog walk. It's really nice to have a good look and see if we can identify those trees during this trickier time of year. So really looking forward to this. Thank you ever so much, Neil. I shall hand over to you.
Right, thanks, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. So Rachel said a bit about me that I'm from Avellana Ecology. I'm self-employed ecologist, and I've got over 25 years botany experience. I've This is the first webinar I've done on winter tree ID, but I've run a lot of winter tree ID courses and guided walks, especially on the Downs and Lee Woods in Bristol. But it's good to go through things, and this is going to be a webinar covering winter tree ID for beginners. It won't cover a lot of species in detail. We'll look at some confusable species and some of the more common and distinctive species that you might see, and look at a lot of the features that you need to look at. So we'll probably only really look at about a dozen or so species, maybe a few more. But my advice is just get outside, go and look at the whole tree when you do trying to learn winter tree ID, and then rather than just relying on one feature, sometimes one feature is a very good pointer to helping you ID, but looking at the whole tree and the context for it, what habitat it's in, etc., is really good. And if you can, go out with experienced botanist or a group who's got a lot of knowledge. So, right. So, so I said there's a range of features you can look at to help you identify trees sort of from October through to February, March, when there aren't any leaves or not many leaves. Nowadays, quite a lot of tree leaves are still on the trees in December, but now's a good time to start looking. I'd say November's a really good time, November, December. And I'd say it's not as difficult as you might think to identify a lot of the native broadleaf tree species from features other than leaves. So these three photos are just examples of the features you'd look at. Like there's there's a horse chestnut bud, but I'll talk about that more later. Um, an oak, the shape of an oak, and also the bark of an ash. So the main features I'd say you need to look at, I put as down as the first one is twigs and buds, and I'd say that is probably the one thing that I'd recommend looking at first, if you can get close. If there's low branches, you can get close to have a good look at the twigs and the buds. That's really good. Obviously, there's the bark. A lot of trees have quite distinctive bark. Then you've got the fruits and the flowers. I'm not going to cover hazel in this as one of the main species, but I've just done an example here. Um, the top two pictures are of hazel catkins. So they're the male flowers. And the picture on the left is at an early stage, so sort of late summer, autumn. And then the one on the right is when they've developed a bit more, and they've become sort of more spread out and elongated, and that would be sort of late winter, generally early spring. So that a lot of people call the hazel catkins lamb's tails, but you'll get catkins on species like willows and birch as well, and they can help you identify the different species. Um, the picture on the bottom right is of hazel female flowers, and these are tiny pink flowers. They're quite difficult to spot, but you can actually see them growing on the buds, and they're beautiful little flowers. So that's something else to look out for. And then the other things you can look at, I'll go into more detail on most of these, but I won't on the flowers. We'll talk about fruits in a minute, and the tree form or silhouette. So the general shape of a tree can vary from one species to another. It can vary quite significantly. And then you can use leaves as a helpful ID feature, but you need to be very wary about this. If they're on the tree, that's fair enough. You can tell that they definitely belong to that tree. But if they're on the ground, they they you can have to sort of like add up all the different factors, other features, but they can help you decide it is that species. But they could be from another tree nearby, so you just need to work that out and not rely on leaves on the ground as a primary identifying factor. And then we've got the habitat, so there's different species will be restricted to certain areas or prefer certain areas. So, first of all, going to say a bit about twigs and buds. Excuse me. So, so the twigs, the current year's growth on a tree, and each twig can have different features to it. Like might be different colours. Some of them might be more angled. Some of them very rounded. Some will be hairy. Some will be hairless, and so on. There's a lot of different types that you can get. These pictures here, we've got a bit about the bud arrangements on the twigs. So the top left one is ash, and that's opposite. So you have a terminal bud, so that's the bud right at the top, and quite often that's larger than the lateral buds, which are the ones on the side. So On ash, the terminal bud is quite over twice as big generally as the lateral buds. So the two on either side of the bud of the twig, just below the lateral bud, are just below the terminal bud, sorry, are the lateral buds. And you'll get them, and then you'll get buds lower down arranged opposite each other. In some cases, they're slightly lopsided, so they don't always line up exactly. But compared to the next type, they are very close to being opposite each other. And the opposite buds will include things like maples, dogwood, and so on. There's quite a few that are opposite, but there's more that are alternate. And an example of that is the hornbeam, which is the picture to the right, immediately to the right of the ash. And you can see they're not opposite each other. They alternate down the stem, spaced out down the twig. So there's a huge number of species that native species that are alternate buds. Then you've got spiraled, which is very similar to alternate buds, but they sort of spiral around the twig rather than being in line with each other on the twig. So it's not that easy to tell from these photos, but this is I think it's a willow. I think it's a goat willow, although willows do hybridize, I expect a lot of you know. So but it's probably a goat willow, that one. And they spiral, so they're not completely in line with each other. And you've got also things like oak will be spiraled around the stem a bit. There's quite a lot of things about buds that can vary from species to species. The color obviously is different on all of these ones, but they can be sort of quite rounded, quite pointed. Some will be hairy, some will have the scales on the buds will be hairy or fringed with hairs or or slightly different color from the actual bud as well. So there are a lot of different things. We haven't got time to go through all of those details at the moment, but that's just something to look into when you try to ID, and there's excellent books to help with that, and web pages and apps and so on. So we'll talk about those at the end. So the next thing is the fruits. So this varies quite a lot. There's four general broad types of fruits that you can find on trees in autumn and winter. Some of them will come out in the summer while there's still leaves on the trees, but they quite often they'll persist till later in the season. In some cases, you'll find the withered stems of of the um, of the fruits or nuts or um, helicopters and things like ash keys and so on, still on the tree when the actual fruits have blown down, and that can help you ID. For example, something like white beam, you'll get the berries, but they'll either be taken by birds or they'll drop off, but you can still see the withered stalks, and adding to that the other features you might look at, like the twigs and so on, you can sort of deduce that it's actually a white beam. So the first species, the first type of fruit is a nut, and that's I think we all know what nuts are, but acorns are an example of that. Then you've got things like chestnut and hazelnut and so on. So there's not loads of those. There's a few species, native species that have nuts, and a few naturalized ones like walnuts and so on. But I'll talk about horse chestnut later. That's not a native either, but it's naturalized. And then you've got drupe, which is a fruit with a single stone or seed and a hard shell, and a fleshy middle. So things like cherries, damsons, and so on. Then you've got samaras or samara, I'm not sure the best way to say that. So things like maple helicopters, which is the middle picture, middle top picture, and the middle bottom picture, which is ash keys, but I'll talk about those a bit more when we talk about those species. Things like elm as well will have those. So you might see the elm flowers or keys sort of late summer, autumn. And then you've got a pome, which is a fleshy fruit. They're all in the rose family. So you'll have things like apple and hawthorn, um, rowan, white beam, etc. The other two pictures here on the right is the spindleberries, which is a native shrubby species that you'll find in quite often in hedgerows, but in woodlands as well. And the bottom right is Gelder rose berries. So that's another shrubby sort of woodland species that you'll also find in hedges. So moving on to the bark, uh, there's a couple of very distinctive species that I haven't talked about these in detail, but I just thought I'd like to highlight the fact that these are ones that you can relatively easily work out that they are a particular genus from the bark. So the first one is the third picture along is silver birch, um, and that's got very distinctive silvery bark with, you can't actually see it very well on this picture, but quite often it has sort of black diamond shapes within, interspersed amongst the paler silver areas. And then you there is also downy birch is the other native species. So you need to sort of look at other features to work that out, including the habitat. So downy birch sort of prefers slightly damper areas. Um, and it has, as the name suggests, it has sort of hairy twigs and which the silver birch doesn't. The other one to the right of that is on birch, you just need to be wary about introduced species. There's a lot of birch, other non-native birch species, particularly in parks and places like that. And then to the right of that, we've got a wild cherry. There's two native species of cherry, wild cherry and bird cherry. And the bark is very distinctive with these shiny, on the wild cherry, very shiny bark. On the bird cherry, not so shiny, but they've both got these sort of rings around them, which are very distinctive markings. And these are the lenticels, which are the breathing pores for the tree. So it's the way they take in air. So next, we'll just quickly look at structure and shape. And there's different tree species will have very, very contrasting outlines or silhouettes. So from a distance, you can identify species or genus relatively easily. It's quite easy to tell an oak because they're quite rounded with a domed crown. There are other species that have quite domed top like the ash. But if you get closer to the ash, you'll see it's got twigs that actually point upwards. So the branches sort of droop down a bit, but then the twigs point upwards. One that's got very drooping branches is the birch, and that's the picture on the right. Sorry, the picture on the left is the oak. And then certain species are more triangular or conical, so something like alder would be. But there's some, I think there's some really useful information on that in some of the tree books, like the Collins tree book, which shows the tree silhouettes rather than when they've got leaves on. So that's something worth looking at, but there's lots of good information out there. Then the habitat, certain species are restricted. So wetlands, I'd say alder and willows are the two main ones. So particularly alongside rivers or in wet woodlands and places like that. You will get other species, but those are two of the commonest ones within those habitats. Then calcareous soil, you'll get spindle, wayfaring tree, quite a few other species will prefer or that habitat like ash, but that they won't be restricted to that particular habitat. And then acidic soil, birches tend to be more widespread on acidic soil, and so areas like heathland and so on, and sessile oak more so than English or peduncular oak would be found on more acid areas. So I'm going to move on to look at a few different species in a little bit more detail now. So firstly, I think some people get hawthorn and blackthorn mixed up. It's easier to get them mixed up in the winter than it is in the summer. So in the summer, you can see the leaves are, I haven't got a picture of the leaves on the blackthorn on here, but the leaves on the blackthorn are entire. So they're just sort of cordate type linear leaves that are toothed rather than being lobed, like deeply lobed, like the hawthorn leaves. So that is one difference. But in the winter, you will you'll need to look at the twigs and spines and the bark and also the fruits, particularly. I haven't got a picture of the bark on this, but the bark on hawthorn tends to be sort of relatively pale, greenish grey, and as they get older, you get it gets quite fissured and flakes off into into sort of blocks rather than or plates, and whereas the blackthorn, the bark is very dark, sort of sometimes black, or dark brown, and that would tend to peel off more. It's a prunus, so it's related to cherry, so it sort of looks a little bit similar to the cherry bark, but not with the rings round it. Something I forgot to mention earlier on the bark slide was that you have to be a bit wary about the tree species for the age. The age of the tree will affect what the bark's like. So, for example, an ash tree will have very smooth greyish green bark when it's relatively young, and as it gets older, the bark will become quite fissured, so with grooves down it. So that is something that you need to be aware of, and that will happen for quite a lot of species. So yeah, the next thing to look at is the fruits. So the difference between hawthorn and blackthorn is you've got haws or haw-berries on the hawthorn, which are these little red berries, and the blackthorn you've got sloes. So these are sort of bluish purple, um, very good for making sloe gin with, but the hawthorn's good for making hawthorn brandy as well. But that's just one of my things I do, as well as doing tree ID. So you can quite often you'll see berries will stay on for a very long time, or there'll be a few, and they're quite, even if they're quite dried up, you can tell the difference from between one species and the other. And the next thing to look at is the twigs. Hopefully you can see on the blackthorn one on the right that they have very long spines. It might not be possible to see, but they do have buds that go all the way along the spine. So you get multiple buds on each of the long spines. Occasionally you get some trees that don't have as many spines on. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but that's something to look out for. And if you are surveying an area, I'd recommend looking, at more than one set of twigs to check what species it is. And so on these, they're quite angular, like the the spines are sort of like 45 to 90 degrees. They don't sort of they're not sort of randomly at different angles all over the place, which hawthorn tends to be more sort of curved. The twigs might curve or bend around a bit more rather than being straight like these, like the blackthorn. So that's one difference. The other difference is the picture of the hawthorn twig on the left. You have quite a lot of shorter spines with buds at the base, generally only at the base of the stem of the spine. You do occasionally get exceptions, but it is, yeah, generally they will be just buds at the bases of the spines, and more buds on the blackthorn. So those are probably the key differences. Right, so I'm going to say a bit about the oaks. So we've got two native oaks, the pedunculate or English oak and the sessile oak. And then there are a number of non-native oaks that have become sort of naturalized and can be a bit of a problem species. So we've got Turkey oak here. And just a bit about some of the differences between pedunculate and sessile oak to start off with. So sessile oak is so called because sessile means unstalked, and that refers specifically to the acorns. So you can see from this picture that the acorns are all clustered together without and right next to the leaf, and they don't have a stalk on them. But the peduncular oak has a long stalk on it. So that is one way of differentiating them. To be honest, unless it's a mast year where you get a lot of seeds and fruits, I don't tend to see that many acorns on a lot of the trees I look at. I think it was like I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, there were a lot of acorns, but I don't tend to see that many. So the thing to remember if you're doing summer tree ID to tell the difference is to remember that it is the acorns that are unstalked on sessile, and the leaves have a stalk, and it's the other way round on the peduncular oak. So the acorns have a stalk, but the leaves don't. Other things you can look at in the winter, generally the bark is fairly similar on both species, but as they get older, they become very furrowed and fissured, quite distinctive. But if you're looking at the twigs, they're quite brown, quite sort of knobbly and spiraled, and they have a lot of scales on the bud. So these are the scales that cover the bud to protect it when it's developing. If it's quite an effort and it can be a bit tricky, especially you might lose count, but if you're turning the buds round to look at them, if they have fewer scales, they're likely to be peduncular oak, say less than 20. If they have more than 20 scales, they're likely to be a sessile oak. But that can be a bit tricky. So that might just be to help you confirm ID and or be aware that there are hybrids as well. So that doesn't help. So moving on to the turkey oak, you'll see there's a picture of the twig there with the buds, and they have these whiskers on the bud, so around that you don't get though get on the English oak or the sessile oak. So if you've got whiskers on the buds, it will be turkey oak. The other thing that will be different is that the acorn cup will have little whiskers around it as well. So that's quite relatively straightforward one to identify. So next is ash. So one of the most common ones, but sadly becoming affected really badly by ash dieback. And the first thing I would say to look at if you can see them easily or reach them, is the twigs and buds. And the buds are these dark chocolate brown to black, large pointy buds. That the terminal bud is very large, lateral buds not so big as I mentioned earlier, quite sort of greyish green twigs. And then the bark be quite grooved or fissured, not so much as oak, but as they get older, they will become more so. And then you've got these very distinctive ash keys, which are the fruits. So they'll hang down from the branches in these big clusters, and they're very distinctive and quite different from the sort of helicopters that you'll get on the maple family. So moving on to the maples. So we've only got one native species of maple, and that's field maple. But we have got two sort of quite well naturalized species, which are sycamore and Norway maple. The sycamore, there is some debate about whether some people think it is native or it's been here a very long time anyway, and it has become part of our sort of native flora. So I'd say we'll start with the buds on this one. So they've both got, as you can see, they've both got opposite buds. They're not alternating down the stem. So the sycamore always has these big fat green buds with slight paler sort of scales around the edge. And again, like a large terminal bud and smaller lateral buds. And then the field maple, again, opposite buds, and they're sort of reddish brown, but they'll have hairy, pale, sort of whitish, greyish scales on them. So they look very different from the sycamore buds, and they'd be quite a lot smaller. And then the picture in the middle, we've got the helicopters or seeds from the uh, field maple and sycamore. So sycamore on the left, and the sycamore sort of droops down. So that's very different to the field maple, which they spread out horizontally. And for generally they're similar size. I think this field maple was particularly large specimen, and the sycamore I got was quite small. But they can be, the sycamore could be bigger quite often. And one other thing to mention when I mentioned Norway maple, they will have similar fat buds to the sycamore, but they'll be more of a dark red to brown, so similar shape and size, but not this this sort of bright green. And the final thing I'll mention on these is the bark. So the bark is sort of quite sort of like cracked looking on the sycamore. It sort of comes off in plates when it gets older. And on field maple, you can have this thing they call, some of the books say, call a crocodile back. So it's these sort of very ridged, corky looking twigs and bark. So that's something else to look out for. All right, so a couple of other native species. Beech is particularly common. So beech and hornbeam are very closely related, and there's some similarities, but they are quite different in other ways. So I'll start with the twigs and buds. So the one on the left is the beech, and they tend to have these long, thin, pointy, cigar-shaped buds, and they branch away from the stem, so they stick out at an angle from the stem. And hornbeam has similar sort of shaped buds, but they're not as long and pointy, they're not as big, and they also are more sort of adpressed, so they're onto the side of the twig. They don't stick out as much of an angle. And both of these species are, as you can see, they're alternating up the stem. They're not opposite each other. Another key difference is there's a couple of beech nuts or beech mast at the top of just above where the twig is. And they are these spiky seed cases that you get with beech, and they're very distinctive, and you'll see those now quite often, a lot of them on the ground below the tree. On the bottom right, there's a picture of the hornbeam. They're sort of keys, really, a bit like the ash, but they're beautiful in the summer and autumn. You might see remnants of them now, but I think they probably will have disappeared. But they're very different from the beech mast that you get. And then another key difference is the beech has very smooth greyish bark, which stays smooth until they become a veteran tree. So most trees, even very large ones, will have very smooth bark, whereas the hornbeam is quite a distinctive. I can't remember how they describe it now, but it's a very sort of grooved pattern. I love hornbeam. It's one of my favourite trees actually, and I love the way the bark patterns develop. So another not native species, but one we've had for a long time. I think it's only been here about 400 years, but it is pretty common in parks, gardens, and plantations, and so on. And it's a shame you can't actually touch this one to ID it, but if you were out in the field, you'd feel this very sticky, huge green bud, not green bud, huge bud, that's sort of brownish yellowy colour with alternate buds again, like the sorry, not alternate, opposite buds like the ash. But yeah, the when they first come out, they are extremely sticky, so they're really noticeable. And obviously, you've got the fruits, which are the conkers. So I think that's one that a lot of people would probably find relatively easy to identify. So sorry, this photo isn't great, but I think it just about shows that you've got the red twigs with opposite buds on dogwood. The scientific name is Cornus sanguinea, and another name for it, old name for it, is blood twig, because you get these very dark red twigs. So most trees or shrubs will have these very red twigs on them, but they can be green in the shade. So if you see something that looks like a dogwood but it's not red, it probably is a dogwood, but you just need to check, um, the buds and the twigs, um, to check whether it's that species or not. Um, it's quite often found in, I think it's found more in more calcareous soils. So the final species I've got here is alder. So one of the species I mentioned that prefers wetland habitats, and it's unique really. It's the only broadleaf tree that's got cones. So these are the female um, flowers and fruits. Um, so you'll get male catkins, the drooping catkins, like I showed you for the hazel, um, but you'll also get these cones, which they're still on the trees now, so they're very distinctive and a good identifying factor. Do be a bit wary because there are some non-native species of alder, so you might have to check that on some of the other features, but the native species is relatively easy to identify. And I don't think the colours come out that well. They do lose a bit of the colour, but the buds are very sort of purple, have a purple tinge to them, and they some of the books they say they look a bit like boxing gloves. So, but I think you have to use your imagination for that one. So that's more or less it. Just going to run through a few of the references. The first thing I mention is this book, which you can't really see, but it's listed up there. Price and Burswoden. the winter tree aid gap guide, and that's really good. The photographic guide, it's got brilliant descriptions and goes through each species alphabetically by common name. It doesn't cover as many species as the next one on the list, which is a key with drawings, but that's really good book as well. And if you want to do ID concentrating on twigs, I'd recommend the John Poland book. And then there's Woodland Trust, How to Identify Trees in Winter, the web page. And there's also my web page. I've got some resources, and they include a handout on 12 common trees in winter and a references sheet, which expands on the references we've got here. So that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Neil. You've given me so much to think about when I go out on my dog walk later, actually. I'm going to be looking for all sorts. So yes, please do feel free to pop your any questions at all you may have for Neil, either in the chat or the Q&A. Um, so I had one really quick question, funnily enough, quite early on that asked, why are ash samaras called keys? And I'm going to ask you, Neil, is it something as simple as because they hang from the branch
Yeah,
like
they
a
hang down. They
bunch? Is that
look a
literally
bit
it?
like a bunch of
Yeah.
keys. Yeah,
I wondered if it was something that simple. I thought that was the case.
yeah.
There's nothing any more sort of technical to
No, no, not as
it.
far as I know.
Thought that was the case. Brilliant. Another quick question I have here. Let me have a look. Do beech and hornbeam have the same general structure and shape?
I'm not, not. I don't. They not exactly. I'm trying to think. They no. I'd say similar. I'm not. I can't answer that specifically, but I'd say yeah. An ash. Sorry, did you say beech and hornbeam?
Beech and hornbeam, yeah.
Yeah, I'd say a beech quite often will grow to be a bigger tree, but so that might affect the you know, the structure of it a bit.
Right, thank you. God, I've got a very Christmas themed question here. We're getting there, aren't we? We're nearly in December.
Yeah.
Are there any native trees that mistletoe prefers? Do you know?
Poplar and lime are two of them. There's a lot on limes, definitely, and I've seen them on poplars quite a lot. But you
Yeah,
can find them on a lot of other species, sometimes on fruit trees, like apple trees.
yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, next question I've got here is for downy birch, actually, regarding downy birch. Do the
Mm.
twigs lose their twig hairs in late winter?
The hairs, no, no, you can still. I've found them all through the winter. So looked at them in February and found them.
Yeah, it's a really good question, though. Something that struck
Yeah,
me
there's
really early on is how things can change. Even, we're saying about
yeah, you
identifying
do
trees
need to
during
be aware
winter.
through the season.
Yeah, particularly I was, funny enough, weirdly, and that was the picture that you showed on, I think, one of your first slides, the difference
Mm.
between a hazel catkin, for example, between November
Mm.
and February. So that is something to bear in mind when you're looking at some of these ID
Yeah, because
features,
if you
timing.
didn't know and you looked and came back, you'd think they were different things.
Yeah, yeah,
Just going back to the downy birch, the other thing about downy birch is they won't have shiny twigs, but the silver birch will. They'll be more shiny.
yeah. Um, and I've got another question here. Apart from silver birch, are there trees with distinctive bark colours?
I I think it does. I mean, they're not as distinctive, but some of the cherry can be quite distinctive, and like I mentioned, the difference between the blackthorn and hawthorn is relatively distinctive, but not to the same extent as the birch.
Yeah. Um, the other question here is, is beech the only tree really that tends to keep its leaves over the winter, especially in hedges?
Um, no, I've been noticing oaks quite a lot have kept the leaves, and there are some of the sort of introduced oak species that seem to keep their leaves quite a long time. There's one on the downs in Bristol that's I can't remember the actual name of the species, but it's a hybrid between a cork oak and another one, and that keeps its leaves virtually through almost the whole year.
Yeah, I guess it can depend so much on the conditions as well, can't it? And
Yeah,
the
definitely. Yeah,
timing of dropping.
I didn't really talk about much about sort of the difference between trees that are within a woodland or open, in a field or an open area, because that will affect the structure of them as well, the shape of them.
Yeah. Um, Here's a good question. Is there a particularly good time to spot the female flowers on a hazel? When would you be heading out to take a look for those?
Um, Probably later, but I think I have seen them, at the end of the year rather than in January and February. But yeah, you should be able to see. It might be slightly more reliable in January, February.
Yeah. Okay, just I've got two more questions here. I think we've
Mm.
probably got time for a last, well, actually two or three. They're popping back up again now. Um, okay, so Anne's asked, we have most of these trees in our parish, around the
Mm.
locality of the Green. Is it worthwhile doing a survey and notifying the parish council? That's a really good question, Anne. I think it really depends on what their sort of monitoring plans are. The parish themselves, it's worth having a chat to your parish councillors and asking
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
if it's something they're interested in. If it's not, let's get them interested,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would say. Um,
Yeah,
okay.
I could run an event to
Yeah,
do
that would be fantastic. Let them
learn
engage in
winter
the
tree
community.
ID.
Yeah, yeah, and getting them interested. Here's a good one. Are there any tips to identifying possible hybridized oaks? Somebody's mentioned they haven't been sure when they've seen a confusing oak.
Yeah, I have to admit, it's not something that I've found particularly easy. Um, I would look like I do with willows. You can sometimes see some features that appear intermediate. So you might have leaves, say, on a willow where there's grey and goat willow, and some of the leaves look like a goat willow, some look like grey willow, and some look halfway between. It
Mm.
may be on an oak, you might have some of the leaves or the buds that seem to have stalks or not stalks, or more scales or fewer scales that may indicate that it's a hybrid. But yeah, I don't know. I'd have to investigate that and really do a
Yeah, it's
proper
tricky though.
study.
Yeah,
The
and actually,
John Poland book might have some good information on that for the twigs, because that is quite detailed.
oh, that's a good tip. Thank you for putting these references.
Mm.
I'm totally going to nab those. Um, some really, really useful resources there. Oh, funnily enough, Michelle's also noted that she's also seen a lot of oaks um, this week in Milton Keynes with nearly all their leaves still on. So that's agreeing with
Mm.
what you were saying previously.
Yeah, yeah, it's not that surprising, well, it is surprising, but and until recent, well, we did have a little cold spell before, but until recently it's been pretty mild.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is that it's been quite mild, as you say,
Mm.
until very recently. So a lot of the trees have kept their leaves, and now all of a sudden having a real cold snap, and we're seeing them all drop all at the same time almost.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Right, well, that's all perfectly timed. I'm seeing a lot of
great.
thanks coming in now rather than questions.
Mm.
And also thank you ever so much for coming, everybody.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
biggest thank you to Neill. Thank you so much for spending the time to put that together for us. That's been really enjoyable, and I'm
Mm,
sure, like me, everybody's going to head out and be noticing and taking notice,
mm.
a lot more detail now. So thank you ever so much. But do visit our website as well to see any other upcoming webinars or events. Thank you so much, Neil. It's a pleasure as always.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, it was nice to do that, and
It's lovely to
enjoyed
keep us
it.
ticking over through the winter months, I think, with our
Mm.
ideas, Nick. Good to challenge ourselves through the winter. Lovely. Thanks so much, everybody.